quite ironic that when many governments around the world declare that the fight against terrorism is their #1 priority, this hasn't stopped. The fear has continued, the attacks have continued. We have to wonder, why is this the case? For the past 20 years, I've been working on the question of political violence and terrorism. Its persistence in our lives, in our times, in our societies, begs the question, why? Could it be that the policies governments think will prevent violent extremism might actually be making things worse? In the aftermath of the 9/11 attacks on the United States in 2001, you could visibly see that the world has been securitized. A certain architecture of things has materialized, literally. There is a certain presence of the state security that has been increased. The militarized presence has really transformed the scene of the world around us. There has been new legislation that has increased powers of surveillance, that have given more of an ability to shrink the privacy space for citizens around the world. News alerts all the time, keeping the citizen on their toes. A certain phraseology of be careful, observe, report.
If you see something that doesn't look right, speak to staff or text police.
Generally a sense of fear.
See it, say it, sorted.
The threat, has it been lessened? Has there been results in terms of addressing it? And the paradox is that it has not. Quite the opposite. So clearly something is not working. We must remember that the majority of political violence is not carried out in the name of any particular religion, and certainly not only in the name of one. In 2017, here in the diverse London area of Finsbury Park, a man drove a van into the crowd leaving a mosque, saying he wanted to kill all Muslims. But does the securitized response reflect this complex reality? I've come to ask the young people here for their experiences.
I was stopped and searched more than 5 times within 2 months. I felt that I was getting picked because of my color rather than religion-wise.
I was actually searched a few times as well in underground, so-called random searches, which I didn't think it was a random search. It was a norm in that time, and still now, I think that you expect every now and then to get stopped. It's not nice, you don't want that, but every now and then it happens. The narrative has been going around for such a long time. If I'm riding a tube and I see a bearded man carrying a bag, I get suspecting. That's the reality. It's a sad reality.
You mean you have internalized it?
Yeah, it become, like I said, if I am a person of Muslim faith and I get like that, I understand what the other people might fear as well. And I don't think it's necessarily the fault of the people. It's the responsibility of the media who done that. People who of authority who put this narrative out there that a bearded man or a man of certain color may cause harm. This needs to change because we are kind of like brainwashed to think that way.
So does this obsession with security just affect Muslims, or do others feel that they are suspects as well? Looking at post 9/11 and how you have been experiencing a lot of terrorism attack and so on, how did you live through those years, and how do you look at how authorities have been dealing with this?
It was challenging because people's perspective of the minority group had already been made up, and their mindset towards people of color, people of faith, people from a background maybe they didn't understand. It was the fear of the unknown. And we suffered from the collateral damage of that.
What's now expected of minorities after these events, I feel like they're expected to go above and beyond decency in a sense, to not be perceived as a nuisance or a menace or any of these things.
I think it's quite devastating how we're automatically labelled with doing certain activities based on one person's actions. It's not the best example for the younger generation. If they have to walk around in fear thinking that, oh, because I look like this automatically I'm going to be treated like this.
It will always be like this in the future, like how people are labelled and by race, gender, or what religion you are.
It doesn't have to always be like that.
Well, I believe it always will be. I think that's how it is, and it's got to accept it, move on from it. And
living in this traumatized society, everybody's living in fear of being judged, being pointed at, being accused, being isolated. How can we now face tomorrow knowing this is what people think of us?
While the British government claims to celebrate diversity, many feel that their main policy against violent extremism reinforces these attitudes.
Given the right context, all the images from the exercise could be representing terrorism.
Because terrorism, and this is especially important with regard to this training, isn't just the attack.
Prevent's part of the government's contest strategy, which is a counter-terrorism initiative. It asks teachers, for example, to identify signs that somebody might be vulnerable to radicalisation or extremism. Teachers and lecturers might be looking for a change in behaviour, a change in social groups that young people are part of. Mood, for example, it might be that people might sound a bit more aggressive, they might sound scripted, they've taken something from a far-right website or a tweet and they're repeating that. It could be perhaps a change in dress and suddenly an increased religiosity.
You could say the top three are a definition of adolescence.
Indeed, absolutely, very much so.
My son turned 6. The police officer from Prevent and the social worker asked him a lot of questions about his Arabic teacher and what he was learning in Arabic. And I remember my child kept turning to me like, "Mom, why is he asking me the same question again and again?" I didn't know my rights. I feel like there was this big dark hole that I fell into, not knowing, because I sent my son to a school.
We've documented nearly 500 cases of individuals impacted by Prevent to date. These cases demonstrate both an Islamophobic framework that operates within the policy, but also we have now seen how the policy has created a collective trauma to the community, including children. So it's, in essence, the policy is creating what it's supposed to be fighting, essentially.
You have to distance yourself from your family. You just feel more and more isolated day by day. It was just, you fear, you're in constant fear, yet you have to do it alone.
Whether it's teachers, your doctors, your social workers, anybody, you have this mistrust of everybody because you don't know anymore who to trust and you don't know what will happen to your children, if you go to a doctor, if they will report you to someone.
It's very interesting to see that which George Orwell was writing about decades ago has in effect now materialized. It speaks a certain language of authority. It speaks a certain language of demonization. Certain groups are racialized, a certain approach to discrimination that is unnamed. Growing up since 9/11, this generation starts from a completely different perspective than other generations would have had. One where it starts from a point of view of fear, of a certain vulnerability, of having to prove itself, almost being paranoid all the time, this very sense of uncertainty, but also of a certain vulnerability. To find out how this might affect young people psychologically, I've come to meet Laverne Antrobus, a psychologist who deals with marginalized young people.
Threat is the number one sort of buzzword, really. You know, we're told it's everywhere. Yes. We're told we're supposed to be highly suspicious of everybody and everything. And I think it has a real impact on one's sense of self. As we know, children are incredibly receptive and perceptive. You know, if they think that their teacher or staff are, or even mental health professionals, are screening them, that starts to really fragment the way in which you can have a relationship with a young person.
And yet today we have kids sitting in a class and feeling that they are in a policing system.
And the impact is, you don't belong here. You don't fit. For a child who's developing and trying to find a way of being in the world, that's a huge sort of rebuff. And I think that what I've seen then happens is that the narrative grows of everybody feeling that's difficult with this child. Suddenly children are then find themselves excluded, they're not in mainstream school, they're in pupil referral units. Young people that I've worked with can find themselves there and really have a struggle, you know, internally about, is this me? Is this the person I am? Well, actually, yes, people are telling them it is. That's why you're there. And then I think there is this sort of gathering momentum for many of them, not all of them, to join.
Gangs?
Yeah, to join.
Violence.
To join because that's the trajectory, and it's very difficult to resist.
Being labelled a threat leads, in many ways, if the person is not a threat and if they are innocent, to a sense of injustice. Many reports show that injustice and alienation are factors in making people susceptible to the appeal from groups like Islamic State, who have found ways to turn the West's glamorization of violence against itself. You go see a Mission Impossible type of movie or a Homeland type of TV series where this is all staged and presented as the logical, normal narrative of the new world we live in. The paradox of this imagery, as it is literally downloaded on these youth, is that it becomes internalized. They look at it, they process it, and they themselves tend to sometimes have to find ways to act it in the video games for hours. And then many of those ending, say, in the military of the United States or armed forces, and in effect replaying those very techniques through the drones that they will send to kill a young man top a hill somewhere in Pakistan. One of the key innovations of the Islamic State was its platform, the videos that they have upgraded to a much, much more different level of sophistication, of quality. In effect, a certain entertainment-driven, Hollywoodized, video gamesy kind of approach, which we hadn't seen. Specifically when it comes to the youth from the Western world, I think it was kind of a perfect storm of the manner in which an entity like the Islamic State spoke. It was very efficient. And they spoke directly to them. There's many, many videos by ISIS saying to these communities, you know, what kinds of lives are you living there? Are you happy there? Why don't you come here? Why don't you do that?
Je voudrais adresser un message à la communauté musulmane vivant encore en France. Vous n'avez rien à faire parmi les mécréants et les hypocrites.
They speak to vulnerabilities. They speak to a sense of identities in development. They speak to them in connecting it with the realities of discrimination that they're going through.
I think there are a lot of issues conflated here. So the first is this idea that, you know, the Muslim community is being spied on. Frankly, most of these cases that we've seen, the court cases, have been young Muslim men. Whether we like it or not, they are the majority of people who are being attracted to these, you know, narratives that are coming out.
Many would dispute that.
Maybe, but I'm just telling you what I've seen in the research that I've done of over 300 court cases. The majority of them have been very young, and they've been male. And they've tended to work in networks, so they've all tended to know each other as well.
Today, a young Muslim male around the world, particularly in Europe, in North America, feels a certain stigmatization. This is a fact. We've had conversations with educators addressing that and feeling that that's precisely the trigger factor.
I think it does a great disservice to the same people from the same community, the same religion, same background, who don't use those grievances as a way to then declare war.
Whenever you see people going far away to kind of unleash this violence or join causes that seem important to them, let's say, for instance, people leaving France to go to the Levant and join Islamic State, what's interesting we find is that there's constantly a reflection about the dimension back home, how to go back to that society and punish it. This is a group of people that left France, went to Syria, but yet what was seemed demonstrably high on their mind was to pitch an attack where they would ship back that violence onto that society, which is their society, where they grew up, with which you have grievances. I think it went beyond their wildest dreams in the sense that it became something of a moment of global violence. It's in that sense that it's important. What did the kid in Marseille or in Minneapolis see into that led them to go and join this? It has inevitably a point about how they consider themselves alienated, rejected.
You day in and day out on your TV sets, watch and hear about the oppression of the Muslims from the east to the west. And ask yourselves, why would thousands of men be ready to give their lives?
If one wants to be honest, you have to see the relationship with interventionism, for instance, that played out unceasingly for the past couple of decades. You know, these operations that took place in Iraq and in Syria and in the Sahel and in Libya. You cannot say that these actors simply come on the basis of this ideology which is apocalyptic and ignore the fact that in many cases they are linked to these conflicts and led to this generation that had basically violence as a way of life.
Jets, major jets, can you move back?
The narrative has been so cemented that this is basically all about religion and Islam, and these guys are coming from there to attack the Western world, and these people are totally irrational. Removing the politics out of that, removing the history, removing the colonial imprint, removing the foreign policy, the interventionism, extracting all of that and leaving this as a set of extraterrestrials descending from the sky and just wreaking havoc on societies. Whether it's at the EU or NATO or the United Nations, and you meet with these top policymakers that are working on designing these counterterrorism policies and engaging with them. The difficult thing is to have them go beyond that which is familiar to them. Particularly problematic is the cultural reading. To understand Western terrorists of the 1970s, such as Baader-Meinhof in Germany, or the Italian Red Brigades, one is invited to examine the societal conditions of, say, post-war Germany and Italy and their relationship with their rebellious youth. Rightly so. To make sense of Al-Qaeda and the Islamic State, one is asked to read the Quran. So clearly what we have right then and there is one yardstick, social, to understand one type of violence, and one yardstick, religious, to understand something else that in fact may not be that different. The paradox in these policy circles is that all these professionals produce detailed reports that identify the causes of extremism as things like poverty, lack of opportunity, and a sense of alienation. And yet the policies that get implemented always emphasize policing, surveillance, and punishment. Racism itself sits unquestioned at the heart of this discussion. on ISIS, with the violence beamed at the European and the American, considered exceptionally unacceptable, not because of what it's doing, obviously terroristic and violent, but because of whom it dares target.
La grande question, enfin pour moi, c'est le domaine que j'étudie, c'est pas Daesh local, c'est qu'est-ce que c'est que cette génération globale Daesh, voilà. Il est clair que l'islam, pour ces jeunes-là, c'est beaucoup plus, oui, une construction narrative qu'une théologie. La théologie ne les intéresse pas.
Une malléabilité de l'action également.
Soit on pathologise la violence, soit on a fait une question de délinquance, soit on la transforme en fanatisme religieux, mais on n'arrive pas à penser des phénomènes de violence de jeunes aujourd'hui qui, dans le fond, se comprennent par rapport à ce sentiment profond d'aliénation.
And many young people have reacted with violence as the imposition of austerity in many countries means that they face lives with fewer opportunities than their parents. One of the strong narratives in the Western world about these faraway places is that they're really literally waiting to come and unleash a violence that is already there. In many ways, it's actually insulting to these parts of the global South where the youth themselves live largely very normal lives and their frustrations are of a different nature.
انا بدا في لونطوراج ديالي كنشوف بزاف ديال الناس تقريبا كاين اللي ما كيدير والو، ربما اللي كاين كيقلبوا مسير، كاين اللي ديجا انتيغري، جونغ كاين بزاف ديال الناس سون بلوكي وما كيلقاوش لي زوبورتونيتي.
20 عام وحنا في الميدان، هاد المراكبه الثقافيه كيسدوا الباب، اللي كتخلي الشباب وحده في الزنقه وما كيدير والو ما عارفش شنو كيدير. غير الواحد ما يستغربش من بعد ملي كيبدا يجي وكيهرس في الماتشات، ملي كيكون ديربي وكيجي داك الشباب وكيبدا يهرس في الطريق، كيهرس الطوبيس وكيهرس المحلات.
Je crois que c'est une combinaison de بزاف ديال les paramètres sociaux d'une part, disons, chômage, pauvreté, peut-être, ou conditions de vie dures, on ne peut pas les blâmer pour avoir fait ça. On peut dire une rage ou quelque chose du genre. Il y a des trucs frustrants même au niveau de soit de la composition, soit de l'écriture, soit même de jouer.
Their frustrations are about development, about education, about getting a job. What we need to reflect on now is where are we going into this new Blade Runner-ish world of violence? What do you do when at the end of the day you have a technique of terrorism, of killing, ramming a car or a van into a population indiscriminately that is used equally by people on the Islamophobic side, for instance, the Finsbury Park attack, and equally by people on the Westernophobic side, as we've seen in Nice. Literally the same technique. Clearly, this is less and less about ideology. It is the return to the West of the violence that it has shipped abroad. And the next phase of this is already playing out as we see more attacks on the West by Westerners themselves. we have to really accept the fact that there's nothing inevitable in all of this. The fatalistic disposition that this is it, this is the new world. No, let's roll back. Those things that have to do with authoritarianism in societies that generate the violence in their midst have to be stopped, democratized, empower. Those things that have to do with interventionism, foreign policy, conflicts, have to be addressed. Stop going there, stop doing that.